There are some places that you travel to without doing much research, and as a consequence, you aren't maybe as enthused to visit a place as other places you visited. And these places, I find, are always the places that exceed your expectations. For me, Brussels was one of those places. Admittedly, I didn't know much about Brussels when I visited back in August. Of course, I'd heard of it, especially in the news in recent years, in particular in the UK, but I didn't really know anything about it. I didn't know what it had to offer, and I didn't really look into it much before I visited either. But you know, Brussels is rich with history and has a creative energy that is very similar to all of my favourite cities that I've travelled to before, some of which I've actually documented on this channel. So back in August, I spent a couple of days in Brussels, about 3 full days in total. And in today's video, I wanted to chat about some of my favourite things that I did in Brussels, especially relating to being a photographer. I'll be putting up some of my photos throughout this video, but if you stick around to the end, I'll be putting a full gallery slideshow kind of thing of all of the photos that I took in Brussels. And I exclusively shot all of these photos on the Fuji GA645. I will of course label the film as the images come up if I can remember which stocks I used. The first thing that I noted about Brussels was the architecture. The architecture in Brussels is kind of like a mixture of contemporary, a mixture of like Flemish architecture, and then a mixture of like Gothic architecture that is more reminiscent of other places in Europe, like Paris, for example. I think all of these different styles of architecture helped to make for some really interesting photos. And you also had the cobbled streets, which I love. You know, Manchester, where I live, has a lot of cobbled streets. And one of the things about cobbled streets, which is amazing to photograph, is the way that light reflects off of them, especially when it's raining. And when I headed to Brussels, it was raining quite a lot whilst we were there. So I was able to kind of, you know, photograph that and get that kind of autumnal feel, even though it was the end of summer. So really closely related to the architecture in Brussels is the street art that the city is renowned for. I've never seen a city with so much street art. It really does like treat its streets and its buildings as kind of like a canvas. One of my favourite bits was this little painting of a character that it looked as though it was projected on a wall. I wish I knew the artist's name because I would link them, but I will put something on the screen so you can have a look at what that looked like. So Belgium is actually the home of Tintin, the cartoon character. And so a lot of the artwork around the city was comic book inspired. And you know, these comic strip kind of style things, you can actually go online and find a map of all of this amazing street art. So if you want to kind of do a trail around the city, then you can do that. I'll link it in the description. We did it for a little bit around some of the streets, and it was definitely a really cool way to see loads of different street art. The graphic style and the colours of the artwork was a really nice kind of juxtaposition, contrast to the like Gothic architecture around the city. So I thought that was really interesting. I've never really seen a city with such kind of traditional architecture embrace such a graphic style of street art. And of course I did head to the official Tintin shop and I got this Tintin book, which basically shows like all of the sketches, which I thought was really cool. If you guys have been following this channel for a while, then you know that I actually studied graphic design. That was what my degree was in, and that's how I got into photography, and it all came from kind of a love of drawing and sketching. So to see kind of like these comic book sketches, I thought that was a really cool little book. But I will link this book in the description if you are interested in having a look. So one of my favorite things that I visited in Brussels was actually a film lab. If you guys have watched my travel videos before, I do kind of like to get my film developed in whatever city it is that I have shot the film in. So when I went to Glasgow, I used a Glaswegian film lab. When I went to New York, I used a film lab in Brooklyn, and I didn't want to kind of make an exception on this trip. So before I headed, I researched some film labs and I found one. I think it's called Mori. I'm not really sure how you pronounce it. I will put it on screen. But this film lab was one of the nicest film labs I've ever been in. It had such a kind of cool and refreshing atmosphere inside. Really great interior. There was like a little space to sit, a wall, like a gallery wall of people's photos. They sold cameras, they sold film. They are also a lab, so you can obviously drop your film in to get developed and all that. Something else that they do is they do workshops, like photo walks and printing workshops and stuff like that, which is really cool. So if you are in the Brussels area and you want to go to some of them, I definitely want to return and give that a go. So I'm going to link that in the description. The turnaround was really quick. I think I waited like less than a week for the scans. I didn't get my film shipped back to the UK, which is something I usually do, because of import taxes and stuff like that. It was going to cost 35 euros to ship back, and honestly I just didn't think that that was worth it, especially when, you know, the film that I was getting developed didn't even cost that much. So they kept my negatives, but there is the option to ship back if you're willing to kind of spend that kind of money. One of the reasons I love to visit film labs in other cities is not only because I want to support those independent businesses within that city, but also because it takes you to places that you probably wouldn't go to otherwise. They tend to not be in like really touristy areas. And that's why, so a lot of film labs will have kind of like drop-off points around a city. So you might be able to go to like a bookshop and drop off your film there, and they will send it to the film lab. And I think that's a really cool idea, especially if you're kind of short on time or something like that. But it's something that I don't do. I'd rather go and actually visit if I can, because it takes you to a different part of the city. And we got the tram system over to the lab. It didn't take long at all. And yeah, it was a completely different part of the city that I would have visited otherwise. So definitely would recommend doing that if you are, wherever you are, trying to find kind of, you know, local film labs that you can support. But 3 days in the city definitely was not enough. You know, it's a small city in comparison to something like New York or Paris or even London, at least what I explored was. And although I feel like I did see quite a lot of it and I was kind of growing familiar with some of the places and the streets and stuff, I would like to spend a little bit longer there, and I definitely intend to return. So if you do have any recommendations, if you've been to Brussels, if you live in Brussels, for things you can do as a photographer or just, you know, generally, then please do drop me a comment and let me know. But for now, I'm going to roll through some of my photos from Brussels. The film lab, the book that I mentioned, all of that good stuff is going to be linked in the description. But I do hope you enjoyed today's video and that you enjoy the following photos. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.